Job applicants who walked out of an interview before it was over. Why did you do it? I walked out of an interview before it began once. The interview was scheduled for 10 a.m., which I double-checked from the voicemail that they left. I showed up about 10 minutes early, signed in, all that jazz, and waited. And waited. And waited. 45 minutes later I got up, asked the receptionist, who looked seriously embarrassed, to let my interviewer know I was no longer interested, and left. 2 hours later I got a rude call asking if I had forgotten the appointment. I laughed and hung up. I had the opposite experience. Talked to a guy over the phone about a general labor job. He told me to be at his shop at 6:30. He said he was very strict about time, so I was there at 6:15 just to be sure. Get there the following day and proceed to be screamed the fuck out for not being there at 6 o'clock. I tried to be polite and say I must have misheard, even though I've never been so sure about something someone has said, but he insisted I was wrong and that I get out. Can't help but feel I'm better off not having him as an employer. I walked out on an interview only once, and it was because the people organizing it were insane. They had arranged a large-scale interviewing process for the entire city. After getting there early I realized there were quite a few applicants, so I didn't mind the fact that I had to wait for about 3 hours. Eventually they asked a group of 3 of us into an office, where we waited again for about 45 minutes. Again, I was happy just to have an interview, so I waited. Eventually I met with a manager for the store who asked the standard range of questions, and I thought I did pretty well. At the end of the interview, though, I was asked to sign a waiver, and when I asked why, I found out that they had recorded the entire interview for the purpose of an episode of A Current Affair, and didn't tell me beforehand. After waiting for so long, just to be disrespected like that, I just walked out. I happened to catch the episode later, and it featured some of the people who I had waited with in the room. Thank God I didn't sign that waiver, because the angle of the investigation was that unemployed people didn't put any effort into getting jobs, completely ignoring the fact that everyone had to wait for hours just to get a chance. I accidentally walked out on an interview. I had driven 4 hours to apply for a bar gaming room job in preparation for moving cities for study. I had purchased an apartment, so I kind of had to take job searching seriously. I had spent about 20 minutes talking to the gaming manager, during which time the venue manager joined us, when some guy came up to them and started chatting to them. I sat there for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, wondering if the interview was over, when I decided that most questions had been asked, and my existence had barely been acknowledged since the guy had rocked up. I half interrupted, shook one of the interviewer's hands and said thanks, and exited the premises with no idea how the interview went. Was crossing the road to my car, when one of the interviewers chased me across the road and offered me the position. Turns out the guy interrupting the interview was one of the owners of the venue. I sometimes wonder how I get through life, considering how socially inept I can be. I went into the interview with my prospective supervisor. I looked around the office and noticed that the garbage cans were full, the walls and carpet dirty, and the supervisor's desk was old and had chips out of it. So, I mentioned that the company didn't seem to be doing any basic upkeep, and then asked point blank, "Is this a good company to work for?" She replied no, and hung her head. I said thanks and walked out. I recently left a job that made me feel that way. I managed a very small independent retail store, and my bosses were just insane. We had been hemorrhaging staff for a few years. There were 2 people working under me when I left. The summer I started, I think there were 8 to 10 of us. Couldn't keep people for more than a year. They'd just leave before that second summer season started. I interviewed one person this March and I would have liked to work with her. I'm sure she'd have good at the job, but I suspected that her identity would have made her a target for the boss, and I didn't want to put a possibly vulnerable person into a hostile work environment. Then I realized I couldn't put anyone into that environment, no matter how thick their skin. I stopped doing interviews, and finally jumped ship myself. My new job is amazing, by the way. The job was advertised as morning shift. The interviewer starts to explain how I would be used as a wild card to fill any shift that was needed, including short notice. Got another one. Went to a job interview for a listing listed as job at a huge high-tech firm on the West Coast. All it was a recruiter scouting for people. There were no interviews with any company, he just wanted to build my profile. He explained that, if he found me a job, I would be an employee of his for 2 years, before I would be an employee for the actual company. I wanted to bail then, but as soon as he said I wouldn't have any benefits and minimum wage, I noted the fuck out. Got up, grabbed my coat. I was shaking my head, while putting on my coat, and as I was walking out, he said, "I'll just put you down as a lost cause." I am familiar with headhunters, and was working with 2 other headhunters at that time. His terms were just straight robbery. I had placed my resume on a few job sites, and accidentally left my resume open to the public. You should not do that. I had gotten a call for an interview for an insurance thing. I was young, and lacked common sense, so I excitedly went. When I got there, there was about 20 other people waiting to be interviewed. Turned out to be a group interview, where some handsome bleached teeth dude talked about how great the job was, where we could set our own hours and make as much money we wanted. All we had to do was pay a lot of money for their special training, and riches beyond our wildest dreams would come of it. Somehow this stupid slapped me in the face, and I got up from my chair and started to walk out. The con man asked me where I was going, and I calmly said, "This is a scam, and I advise others to walk out too." 2 others left with me. They also said it so that I'd be working hours just barely under the limit to qualify as a full-time employee with benefits. Again, none of this was ever mentioned in the job description up to this point. The last straw was that they gave me a 30-minute test to prove I could work on a deadline, based on the actual materials I'd be working with: chicken scratch post-it notes, unintelligible audio recordings, and other horrible sources I had to base my designs on. I walked out of the test about 5 minutes in. I recently went to an interview for a bank in my area. First, the woman I spoke to on the phone misrepresented herself. She told me she was the assistant branch manager. Upon arrival, she told me she was head teller. The branch manager would be arriving shortly. I waited for an hour. After an hour of me double-checking the time and wondering if I'd gotten there instead of early, I got up to leave. The head teller said she'd be there in 5 minutes, but at that point I just figured I obviously wasn't important enough. I left. I got a call back 3 days later apologizing and asking if they could set up another meeting at a bank I was nowhere nearby. I politely declined. Just after I had been given 3 months' notice of layoff due to office closure from a job that I really liked, I took off early one day for an interview across town. When I arrived, I entered a waiting room full of people at least twice my age, in suits, resumes in hand. Upon seeing this sight, I realized I had very little chance at the position being offered, but since I was there, I may as well try. What I didn't expect is that we were all scheduled to interview together. We were all herded into a conference room, where the group interview commenced. After a few rounds of questions, learning each other's qualifications, how we would handle various situations, and so on, we collectively learned that this position was part-time, not what had been advertised, and paid a mere $9 an hour. I walked out along with 3 other people. I never got as far as the interview. So much was wrong. I received a call asking me about my availability to attend an interview, based on my posting on a professional website. I indicated that I was currently in the middle of a project, but would be available to interview in 2 weeks. The woman on the phone yelled, "Then call me back when you are available." Click. She called me. She yelled at me. I wrote that company off. 2 days later she called me again, and asked to set up the interview. She said she would call me, as soon as she had finished a meeting. "You called me, then you tell me you don't have time to finish the conversation that you initiated." Wrote her and her entire corporation off. Get a phone call 3 hours later. So-and-so wants you to call her to schedule an interview on Monday. I definitely no longer want this job, but I do want to see if my predictions come true. I call on Monday. The person who answered the phone told me that it was the woman caller's day off. I am a genius. They call me and give me the runaround. WTF. 2 weeks later, yesterday, they call me again. Again, a person asks me to call at a later date to schedule an interview with a woman who couldn't bother to call me herself. I told them that based on their behavior in the past month on the phone, that I did not have any desire to work for their company. I broke my own code and fired off an email to their director of human resources. This company is a luxury retirement community. There are golf courses, hospitals, clinics, 4 to 6 bedroom homes, clubhouses, townhomes, etc. It seemed like T might be a lovely place to work in my field. If they would treat me in such an unprofessional manner, how must they treat the residents of the community? There were 3 total callers involved. I can only imagine the motives for calling someone, asking for an interview, and then behaving in such a strange fashion. Nope. 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 I had an HR person at a reasonably well-known company send me an email asking if I was willing to have a job interview. Sure, sounds good. I gave half a dozen times I would be available. A week later I realized all the times had passed, so I emailed her asking what was up. She said, "Oh, sorry, things are busy here, give me a few more times." So, I did. A week later I realized all the times had passed again, so I emailed her again. She asked for another batch of times. I sent them. I got an auto response. She'd just gone on vacation for a week. I haven't heard back since. We have a very dedicated team. We often stay after normal office hours. Is that okay with you? Me, sure. I mean, I'm single without kids, so if it's adequately compensated, I'm happy to do as much overtime as necessary. No problem. Oh no, we're passionate about the work we do here, so overtime is not paid. Me, okay then, thank you for your time and goodbye. I had just graduated art school with a design degree, and was scraping by, unemployed and living 5,000 kilometers from my hometown for 6 months. I was getting desperate and antsy when I saw an ad for a multimedia designer on a job board. I called and set up a time for an interview. I didn't have a car, so I called a cab to take me to the address. I was still relatively new to the city, and the cab took me very far out, like a half-hour drive. Eventually, the cab pulled over in front of a bland, suburban house. Something was off. Even the driver was suspicious. "Are you sure you want to get dropped off here?" he asked, sensing my nervousness. I was confused. I didn't really know where I was. This was an era before iPhones, not that I could have afforded one. And my shitty flip phone was dying. Yeah, sure. Just wait for me. If you see me go in, you can leave. I walked up to the front door, which had a sign with an arrow, instructing visitors to go around back. As I walked alongside the house, I turned back, and noticed that my taxi driver, assuming I was fine, had driven away. When I found the back entrance, I was greeted by 2 middle-aged, balding white men, in a basement rec room that had been converted into an office. "Hi, I'm here for the interview." One of the men got up. Yes, that's fine. We just need you to fill out a questionnaire. It should take 30 minutes. I looked to my left. A poster hung on the wall, the portrait of a vaguely familiar, bald white man, surrounded by a glowing rainbow of swirling colors and energy beams. It was L. Ron Hubbard. "Sure," I said. "I just have to let the cab driver know he can leave." I promptly proceeded to walk out the door, picked a random direction, and walked for 40 minutes along the road until I found a bus stop. I was really short on cash, while waiting to hear back from a job opportunity with a company that takes a notoriously long time in the hiring process, and saw a job that was offering $25 per hour for some fire safety company. No other info, with a tagline saying, "Just because it seems too good to be true doesn't mean it is." I thought it was at least worth looking into. Went to the interview, which apparently was a group interview. The guy stepped out, and the first thing he asked was if anyone researched this company on the Better Business Bureau. A few people did. He spoke with them in another room, and then they never came back. Then he started to launch into this drawn-out story about the last 30 years of his life, how someone gave him the same opportunity he was offering one of us now, and that it honestly made him cry, thinking that people were so cynical that they would think he was a scam artist. And he actually did begin weeping in front of everyone, at which point his 20-something assistant ushered him out of the room, before coming back and emotionally launching into his own story about how this guy saved him, and was a genuinely great guy. Honestly, I didn't have a lot to do that day, and the interview was catered, so I stuck around to see what would happen when the guy came back into the room. And he did, with the vigor of an infomercial host, promising everyone that with a $600 deposit, they would be making $100K in 6 months' time. He just wanted a chance to interview each of us one-on-one. At the one-on-one, he started to talk a bit more about how this would be a great fit for me, blah blah blah, and I just stood up, asked for the application I filled out. It had my personal information on there, told him that this was so obviously and clearly a scam, that I hoped that there wasn't anyone dumb enough to actually write him a check. He called me a cynic, and had his assistant escort me out. I applied for a position as a manager of a restaurant. At the time I was already a general manager at another restaurant, and I had years of management experience. They called me and asked to set up an interview, which I accepted. When I arrived 15 minutes early, I checked in and was told to take a seat, where I waited for 45 minutes past my scheduled interview time. When I was finally interviewed, the interviewer was mumbling something about fucking asshole servers, then ranted to me about how upset he was that a server was refusing to pick up a night shift. Then he used a bunch of derogatory terms for women about that server. As the interview progressed, he would start side tangents about his staff and past managers. He then told me that, while I applied to a manager's position, they actually didn't have one available, and that I could serve tables until a position became available. I asked when that might be, and he said maybe 6 to 8 months. I read him the riot act in front of staff and customers about how much of my time he wasted, and how he should never talk about his staff like that, and about his professionalism. 8 months later the restaurant closed.